The APF Friends of Foresight is an APF organized free global public event that gathers friends, communities, and networks of APF and non-APF members to share knowledge, discuss, challenge, question, provoke, and explore ways of making future studies and foresight practice diverse, heterogeneous, and inclusive in the 21st century. The aim of the Friends of Foresight gathering is to discover, see, and shine light on emerging issues and trends that might shape or influence futures thinking and futures work as we know it today, and build prospects for collaboration, network, and community sharing in an open, planetary, and accessible way. The first APF Friends of Foresight was held several months ago with the authors of the book, The Future Start Now, who shared and discussed various innovations and technology shaping the future of society, work, and life. Today, the APF Friends of Foresight shifts to exploring heterogeneity, community, identity, and the context and purpose of indigeneity in futurity. Like, some perhaps a preliminary question would be, how might we build genuine, novel, and authentic radical futures that empower communities to imagine, speculate, and ignite their dreams and visions of what can be? So before we start, let's just give a quick introductions of ourselves. And I would like to start with Modafar. Yeah, Modafar, if you may kindly introduce yourself.
This is just for the panelists. No, all those guests don't need to introduce themselves. Just
yes, right. Yeah, for panelists.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Salam from Dubai. This is Mudaffar. I am Jordanian, resident and working in Dubai. And I'm very thrilled to be part of this panel group and to join you all in this discussion today.
Thank you, Mudaffar. Noel?
Good afternoon. Hiraya Manawari. I'm Noel Digia. I'm the resident futurist of the Philippine Senate, and I'm very happy to be here with you this afternoon, this evening, and this morning. Hiraya Manawari.
Yeah. Laura?
Hello, everybody. Laura Harjo, coming to you from the treaty homelands of Creek people in Oklahoma, US.
Yeah, Lizan?
Yeah, good day to everyone. Lizan here, a Filipina, and propagating Hiraya Manawari.
Eva.
Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eva Okwamu. I'm originally from Cameroon, but I work for UNESCO, and I'm very glad to be here as well.
Pratiksha.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're doing really well. I'm Pratiksha. I'm based in Bangkok, and I'm with the UNDP, and also sort of associating myself as an equity and inclusive futures researcher and practitioner. So lovely to be here with you.
Sophia.
Hi, my name is Sophia. I'm tuning in with you all from Bali, Indonesia, but I'm from Nyack, New York originally, and I'm affiliated with Future Space and the upcoming APFN and a whole range of other exciting projects. Thanks so much for all being here across time zones. Looking forward to this conversation.
Okay, last but not the least, before I turn it over to Marcus, Mauricio.
Hi, everyone. Hola a todos. My name is Mauricio. I'm based in Mexico City, and I'm very, very happy to be here with you all.
Yep, and now on to you, Marcus.
Thank you very much, Chairman. So I'm Marcus Bussey. I'm based in Australia at the University of the Sunshine Coast, and it's just fantastic to be here. It's very exciting to see this dream come true, because Sherman and I were discussing issues around Hiraya Manawari in the light of the work, that amazing work that's happening in the Philippines. And I was saying, well, what about, an indigenous perspective? And it sort of rolled on from there. So I wanted to acknowledge, that the lands wherever we meet actually were once, if not now, indigenous lands. It's easy to forget if you're based in Europe or somewhere that even those lands were once indigenous, but it's become now something of a very important aspect of an emergent consciousness that people of my generation, white, middle-aged, or even more than middle-aged, you know, we are having to grapple with issues that are forcing us to acknowledge the past. And in Australia, there's a common saying amongst historians, particularly, that we are unsettled settlers. And we're talking about white colonial Australia, in which, you know, I love reading poetry, and I was reading Don Domansky, who's a Canadian poet, who a white man, referring to his condition of the land that is nowhere, that is our true home. So modernity, stuck in modernity, many of us have no true home, and we're trying to find roots. And for me, the conversations that I enter into all the time seem to be about being rooted or rootlessness, and also the roots in terms of journeying that we can take through all of this. Now, I have a very dear friend in Australia who, an Indigenous Australian, who pointed me at Laura's book. Cherie Miniacon is my friend, and she's an Indigenous woman living in Melbourne at the moment. And she was saying, look, there's this wonderful book on indigenous futurity. And so immediately I go, oh, I've got to see that. So I went and grabbed it. And there are a couple of things in Laura's book that just stand out for me immediately. And I'm not going to take much time. I just wanted to set the scene, because Laura talks about kin space time envelopes. And to me, that's an incredibly powerful concept that isn't just an idea, but it's something that I think is an embodied realization or recognition of what it means to be fully present in ourselves, in our bodies. And perhaps that's the first land we need to reclaim, because we've given our bodies over to the sovereign state or to the nation state. We've given our bodies over to medical science and many other things. So there's we need to actually take back and reclaim what it means to be human. And that's part of the context there for me. And there's one other thing that I wanted to actually quote, if you can bear with me. Laura was saying early on when she was introducing a book, I just want to give the definition of futurity that she used in the book, and then I'm going to pass it over to you, Laura. So so I'm not going to make you blush or get shy or embarrassed by quoting you to yourself, hopefully. But anyway, here we go. She says this: futurity is the practice of engaging with ways of knowing, performing and celebrating who we are, valorizing and creating new ways and theories constructed with community knowledge, and creating explicit paths or maps to get us to the place we want to be, so that we choose our future and our future does not choose us. So it's about agency and reclaiming that which in the context of we needs to be understood as a community, that we are fellow travelers in community. So as futurists gathered here, I really welcome Laura to the floor. She didn't know what she was letting herself into with the APF, and we had to have some conversations about where we're coming from. But Laura, I really value you're giving us your time, especially at 5 a.m. in the morning. So thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you for that, Marcus. Laura Chaha Chifkidos. Good morning, everybody, or it's morning here for me. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm coming to you from the Mvskoke Creek treaty lands that we were forced to cede. So this is land that was subjected to a land run. So sort of that settler grab for land. So I'm coming to you from that space. And kind of my point of departure here is just giving you a little bit of background of how I come to my work. So, and actually in my book, probably the entire introduction, I kind of trace how I come to my work. So I come from basically a family of community caretakers, community builders, community organizers, and so I teach community organizing, community caretaking. It's called different things, but I would just call it community caretaking. And one of the things that really stood out to me, there are a couple of things that have really stood out to me in my practice through the years of community caretaking and community organizing. And teaching Indigenous students within academia, one of the things that stood out is that students, most of the readings, they start from a point of departure of what Marcus mentioned. So, okay, like here's a city, here's a town, here's a province, a county, a state, a nation state, and the narrative begins for those spaces and places at the point of settler contact. And the dreaming, the imagining, the spatial imaginary for those spaces is really bound up in a settler imaginary and a settler futurity. And so as I was teaching Indigenous students, that's what the bulk of the readings were really grounded in, is like, how do we start from today and think our way forward? And so not really thinking on that there's a palimpsest of Indigenous spaces and places sort of buried under this huge kind of settler footprint. And my students experience Indigenous space and place every day. My family experiences that every day. And so that, in part, that's how this conception or this concept of emergence geographies comes up. So what are the spaces and places that don't get mapped, that aren't talked about? What are the spaces and places that that maybe Indigenous folks, I guess, enact ethnographic refusal? Like, we're not going to open up everything and tell like the city planner or whatever about our spaces, but we know that these spaces sustain us, whether that's ceremonial space, sacred space. So my Indigenous students are sitting in class, and our readings are only grappling with like, okay, how do you create like a central business district for your city? Or how do you develop a main street? And like, so if I go back to our original town sites before we were removed to Oklahoma, so we were removed from the Southeast in like the 1830s to about 1,500 miles away. I don't know what that is in meters or kilometers, but yeah, so we were removed. And but these town sites, the sociospatial use of place has persisted in different ways, through like the way that maybe our, I guess, churches, our ceremonial grounds, informal spaces, it still sort of mimics this socio-spatial enactment of place. And so that's something that is not going to get picked up in maybe a journal article, but our students know that these are spaces that puncture settler space, and they're valid, and yes, and that's part of like their realm of embodied knowledge. And so that's kind of one stream of the way in which I come to this work, that one, valuing the experiences of community, two, acknowledging the spaces and places that, you know, our people are moving and operating in. Okay, and so sorry, it's really early. Sorry. So the other sort of stream is this idea of not yet. So even within Indigenous planning, there's this idea of 7-generation planning, right? And that comes from the Haudenosaunee, and that's that the actions that you carry out today, that you must consider the impact of those actions 7 generations into the future. So in my work, I've done interviews, I did a 300 plus respondent survey, and I asked questions about future. and it sort of flopped. I asked people like what they thought like 7 generations into the future. This originally started out like my research was around 7-generation planning, but that kind of like 150 years into the future, that's sort of hard for people to wrap their head around. 50 years into the future, maybe a little bit easier, 20, maybe a little bit easier, but that 7 generations, people, it was kind of like difficult to speculate that far into the future. And so most of the answers that I received were like pretty neutral. But one of the things that I found is that the closer that people get to a very local scale, the scale of maybe the community, the household, the body, to use the words of Marcus, the more agency that they had, the more they had to say about the future. So this idea of like maybe really looking at even the tribal nation, that's kind of a big institution for a lot of community folks. So like from my survey findings, it was harder for them to really like, okay, how do you think that they're going to be operating in terms of education, in terms of economic development? But like when I asked them, to what degree do you want to see or participate in the language moving forward, or our traditional games, traditional dances, they had things to say. So the whole sort of premise of the scholarship around methodologies of futurity really starts at a very local scale. And in my work, I kind of implicate the politics of recognition. So when I talk about the politics of recognition, I'm talking about grievance claims like to the nation state, or some of the different kind of approaches where we're asked to kind of march out our trauma and be a spectacle to be gazed upon, but then nothing gets done about it. I'm talking about maybe the UN and like giving testimony and people crying, and then it kind of like just dissipates into the air and nothing happens. Or like around missing and murdered indigenous women and giving testimony, or truth and reconciliation commissions. It's sort of like like these large structures don't ask indigenous people to march out their trauma and have this sort of like theater of trauma to gaze upon and nothing get done about it. So that's part of like how I come to this, of just working that in my experience. Now, other folks, like, yeah, maybe that's necessary, the grievance claim aspect of either like maybe a lawsuit with the nation state. I worked on those sorts of things. But like, I had, my father was a fluent speaker of our language, and like, I would say that I squandered that. Like, I was working on centering the nation state and the structures of settler futurity at the expense of indigenous futurity. So, I grew up kind of speaking, I know a mix of like a lot of Mvskoke words, but like I could have been fluent, right? So like I'm trying to get fluent now, but I feel like I squandered that by centering settler futurity. So then what does it mean to center indigenous futurity? And that's what this work embarks upon. So let me pull up this slide really quick and share it with you. Okay, so if I go back to this first sort of stream, that our students didn't see ourselves in the work that we're teaching, the practices in the community of making people come to hearings, and it's not really a dialogue. It's like we're going to talk at you, or we're going to consult with you, but like to what degree do they have authority over what happens? So if you go to like a really good and sort of really old reading to check out, but it still makes sense today, is Arnstein's Ladder of Participation. And so a lot of what students were seeing were maybe tokenism, like you come and like, not you, I'm talking about tribal nations too. In my experience, what I've seen is like to meet the conditions of a grant, you have to do public participation. And so somebody pins up notice of a public hearing at the Native Nations governance complex in the middle of like 7,500 square miles. So that's 14 counties. How are people from these outer communities, they're not going to pass through this space. How are they even going to know? Like, that's not really like true participation. Or even like the idea of like, people have to get up, you hand them a microphone, they tell them what they want. Like, that's not the best way to get a sense of community knowledge. So that's sort of what this also gets at. What are methods that my relatives would feel comfortable speaking from, right? So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about these 4 concepts. So these 4 concepts, they really are rooted in Mvskoke epistemologies. And that's what I would say and bring today, is that if you look towards your own community, what is that community's epistemology? What's their way of knowing the world? What are the values that are important to them? So I start first with Stajati sovereignty. So Stajati means like an indigenous person. And, you know, the English is radical sovereignty. So starting with radical sovereignty, it's this idea of what we call anogechka. So anogechka means love, but it's more of like love for one another, love for community, and doing that sort of caretaking. Others might call it servant-based leadership, but then that idea of servant-based, it still kind of assumes a hierarchy, right? But this idea of anogechka is like, we're together, the power relations are lateral, we're helping one another, we're caretaking. Another aspect of radical sovereignty, which this kind of iconography points to, and this is rooted in kind of ancestral iconography. So this first kind of, it looks like a infinity symbol, but another aspect is that all exchanges between all entities are transfers of energy, be that human, be that plant, be that animal, be that like a sacred space, they are transfers of energy. And so when, like, as maybe community caretakers, when we're working in and with community, like community can sense the energy of a facilitator. If they're like nervous, if they're anxious, if they're uncomfortable, if they're just here like for maybe like some kind of token input, and then that's sort of like outside in. But within the idea of relations, like how are you building relations with one another as well? So a lot of the methodologies that I have kind of like written in this book are meant to not just understand community knowledge, but to build that aspect of relationality. And so one of the things that we did before this panel was, from the book, it's called a Where I Am From poem. And we sent that out to the panelists. The panelists kind of did that poem and we shared it among each other. And so the idea of getting to know one another in that way, that is like just a form of building relationality, but maybe also some self-reflection as we're writing it. But like I now have a better understanding of like some of the panelists, and like for me, that's what Marcus was talking about at the outset, like saying we had a few meetings before this to just kind of like in part, it was really me enacting this idea of radical sovereignty and just getting to form like some sort of kinship relationship with folks instead of just kind of like coming in cold and not really knowing anybody. But that's like a form of radical sovereignty as well. And so that Where I'm From poem is also a form of radical sovereignty, of building out community. Another big one is beading, doing beadwork. So then this idea of building relationality in your community, like what are those kind of activities that people like to come together around? So like during the pandemic, I've actually been a part of a couple of beading circles, like beadwork, beading, a couple of beading circles, and we just get together, we talk, converse, and you know, there's no like particular like outcome other than to get to know each other. Yeah, you know, I think that I was just thinking that second stream, I don't know if I really dug in on it, but it's the idea of not yet, that we're going to plan and plan. You're going to think 150 years into the future, 50 years into the future, but you're not going to see it yet. And that's like a key part of futurity, is that how do you like kind of create what you want to see in the future? How do you create it right now? So those beading circles are part of like responding to that not yet aspect, that we're going to make it happen right now, even if we have to get on Zoom and we don't have much. And when, I was going to say when we come out of this, it doesn't matter. It's like we're making it happen right now, building relationality and radical sovereignty. The next one is community knowledge, and that really gets at this idea of like, we are carrying embodied knowledge in our community. We are embodied archives. Our relatives are embodied archives. I'm sure like everyone's heard that African proverb that when an old man dies, an entire library burns to the ground. So during this pandemic time, we have lost a lot of Mvskoke elders. And, you know, that's a huge piece of indigenous futurity as well, because a lot of it is not written, it's not written down. Like people are living their lives. They don't have time to sit and capture that sort of traditional scholarship. It really happens within the community, within our, I would say, emergence geographies. So felt knowledge, smelt knowledge, dreamt knowledge, all of these are forms of knowledge that are valid. And I think that a lot of our community members and my indigenous students, they have always sort of had that shot down in school. So like in part, my scholarship is to uplift indigenous knowledge as valid and valid for the community to carve out futurity, like activating the unrealized dreams and futures of their relatives. So my relatives, my ancestors had their dreams maybe cut down with being forced to move to Oklahoma and dispossessed of their lands. So there's like community knowledge there. And then in terms of collective power, again, that is not like authoritative power, but it's like, how do communities create the kind of conditions that they wish to live in? But how do they also tap into these alternative economies? And so on this collective power symbol, so the multiple line work, that really is a nod to our traditional dance. So our traditional dance is actually a counterclockwise spiral. And this is, I would say, like 4 fires connected. So at the center of our dances are these fires, and it's not just like that ceremonial ground that dances. It's kind of like the more ceremonial grounds that come and dance at your dance, the better your dance is. Like I can hear people saying things like, yeah, it was a really good dance. There were like 8 or 10 lines of people, and that's like 8 or 10 lines of a spiral. So it's like the more people there, like that's that idea of collective power. So this symbol really is like showing like these maybe four different grounds are dancing together. And that is a nod to collective power, whether that's coming together again, like maybe making a quilt, or for us, I kind of joke around and talk about, we had this truck that was also kin because everybody in the family shared it to tap into alternative economy, because you need a truck maybe to haul something from an auction, a pawn shop, a yard sale, etc. And that's part of kind of like a bartering, sharing, etc. economy that maybe is not kind of bound up in a capitalist sort of economy. And so that piece, like, that's happening. Like these kind of non-capitalist economies are happening right now. They're just happening under the radar. And then lastly are emergence geographies. And that's probably where I would kind of locate kin space time as well. And so these kind of 4 emergence geographies that I really talk about are like your concrete geographies. So like where our tribal headquarters are, ephemeral, maybe where a skateboard crew shows up and assembles in a city and disassembles. Like there's no way to map that. There's no way that city planners even know that that's happening. That's not going to come out in like a public hearing. That's going to come out like maybe people sitting around beating and talking, or making a zine together, or doing some of these exercises I have in the book. Ephemeral, that's also our dances, because they, you know, they're not like staying in one place over time. They show up in different places. And then metaphysical. So that's something that it almost feels like we're not allowed to talk about, or it's kind of scoffed at, but it's very real. So one of the examples I always give is that the National Geographic Channel has a show called Navajo Cops. And so somebody calls and they're reporting that they keep hearing this like screaming or howling. And like if you talk with the local folks, that there is like some kind of entities, like some kind of entity, and probably a spiritual entity, that at night howls. And so if somebody comes in and like, let's say they work for the state of New Mexico and they're there to plan where to put the new school, and there's, oh, look, this site, nothing's around, there's all kinds of space, let's plop it down here. But maybe the community isn't going to surface that kind of knowledge that like, oh, hell no, we don't want that there. Like that's where like the howler comes out at night. But I think that there are definitely different entities. And actually when I have done map biographies in indigenous communities, and it's sort of these more kind of like intimate conversations where there's not a lot of people around, like maybe they do end up mapping, like you can't pass through this space if you haven't asked permission from this particular forest spirit. And so it's kind of like that sort of thing too. Yeah, so, and then lastly is virtual. So that's sort of like a project I'm working on right now, is like how to create these virtual spaces of our tribal towns that we were removed from. So how can our relatives, we've had relatives that have passed and never seen their original tribal town. So like my dad passed before he could see his original tribal town. My mom, she's still alive. She's a tribal elder. I would love to actually map. That's what I'm working on right now, are the original town sites, and mapping them from legal descriptions and land sales and locating them. And, you know, it's probably privately owned, but like just being able to go and see that. Yeah, so that's kind of like the virtual space. So like when you're thinking about virtual reality, games, there's one called When Rivers Were Trails. That's kind of an award-winning game that enacts Anishinaabe kind of values. So instead of like, how many people do you shoot down? It's like, okay, I need to hunt, but here's this person, they're sick. If I don't hunt, I'm not gonna have, and it has to do with displacement in Minnesota. If I don't hunt, I'm not gonna have enough food for tonight, but this person is really sick and I have some medicine to help them. Which one am I gonna do? And so, like, I know when I was playing the game, I was just kind of going through and playing like what I felt I needed to do. So like I helped the person with the medicine, and then in return, that person, I didn't know that that person had food, but they had food, and they gave me kind of like these badges where I had food. So it's kind of like this, it's a lovely game, just like this idea of like reciprocity and these values that get carried out. And that's kind of like teaching young ones futurity from an Anishinaabe kind of perspective. And so these emergence geographies, I call them emergence geographies because they're rooted in our emergent story, where we're coming out of fog, we find one another, we form our clans, and we always have been in movement. So with the encroachment of settlers into Georgia, we were moved into Alabama and we reemerged with our towns there. We were removed through the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma and we reemerged there. The land that I'm on right now, this was part of our treaty homeland and it got rolled back and taken back, and we reemerged. Relocation, trying to send people to the cities to assimilate them. We still reemerged in the cities. Boarding schools, you guys have probably heard some of the things coming up on boarding schools. We have continued to re-emerge. So that's kind of where emergence geographies come from. And it's not a finished story on that. I still think that there's more to develop out from emergence geographies. But to talk a little about kin space time, the way that I sort of imagine it is, and I talk about it in the book. So I'm in a pawn shop, and like if you've been in a pawn shop, I don't know what they call them in other parts of the world, but maybe you guys can tell me. But being in a pawn shop and just smelling like the smell of tools. So I grew up with like probably like 4 uncles and my dad. Those were like my primary kind of like second sort of parents. So kind of like that kinship network. I grew up just being around them, and they're always working on cars or going to the pawn shop to find like a cheap tool or whatever. But the smell of like the damp kind of oil and dirt that settles in on tools, like that's what it smells like to me in a pawn shop. And when I smell that, it's more than memory. It's like, it's invoking like this space and time and kinship moment from like maybe the 70s, where they're like inside this concrete garage in my grandfather's backyard working on something. Or maybe it invokes a moment where like they're helping one another. Or maybe it invokes another moment where like I'm sanding the hood of my own car. Like I'm invoking like the knowledge that I learned from them. And here I am in this pawn shop, and it's sort of invoking like a past, present, and a future all at the same moment. And I think one of kind of the best examples of kin space time too is my child is active in, I say child, my kid, my whatever, they identify as non-binary and queer. They're an artist and a photographer, but they're also revitalizing traditional tattoo practices. And that's also an invocation of like, they are an invocation of a kin space time envelope, because they are invoking these Mississippian symbols, not this exactly, but maybe like some traditional chin tattoos, that sort of thing. And they're also working on like land back campaigns. And so these methodologies, they don't put a ceiling on what our spatial imaginary can be, because often we only think insofar as an institution kind of modulates how far we can think, but it doesn't put a ceiling on it. And that's kind of like, if you think about indigenous futurisms, Black futurisms, and those sorts of writings and science fiction writings, that they are imagining these new kind of spatial imaginaries that are not like, you know, I guess, kind of hamstrung by the nation state. And futures can be imagined, there's no ceiling on it. And I guess the thing about, too, the kin space time envelope is that it gives primacy to kinship relationships. Next, it's sort of like really looks at where it's happening. But what comes last is time. So this thing about futurity is that, yeah, you're activating the possibilities that got cut down of your ancestors. You are creating the future you wish to see right now, and you're setting the conditions in place for a future for the ancestors. So another example of kin space time is that the same stars and constellations that I'm seeing when I'm at our summer ceremonial dances, those are the same stars and constellations. And I know because we have stories about them. Those are the same stars that my ancestors saw, and my future relatives are going to see those same stars, and those stars and the stories that they embody, those hold knowledge too. So that's sort of something that can't be like burned down or erased, because we're going to look up and we're always going to see the stars. And that's sort of where that title comes from, Spiral to the Stars, because it's really a nod to our ceremonial dances. Like I said, they're a counterclockwise spiral, and they're during the summer. They take place all through the night, where you can, see the stars and the different constellations. And those are kin space time envelopes, where it's constantly going. We're constantly in relationship with our past, present, and future when we look at those stars and kind of understand like the stories behind that. And then I kind of want to end on like the idea of like future and futurity. And so Grace Dillon, she's like somebody whose work I really draw upon. Sherman Alexie also talks about this, but it's this idea that we're kind of always sandwiched in between past and future, right? And so for me, future was not a robust enough term to think through what we want to do, what is happening in Mvskoke communities, because the future can be like 30 seconds from now, right? Or it could be 10 years or whatever, but futurity is always taking those three kind of moments into consideration, instead of this idea of like, you're always in a present and you're sandwiched between a past and a future. So that's sort of like what I guess indigenous futurity offers up for my community. Now, I guess the provocation then is not necessarily like, how do you take this framework and apply it to what you're doing? The provocation is, how do you really like understand the worldview, the values of a community, and think that through at a local scale, and think through futurity at a local scale of like what would people want to activate of their ancestors that didn't get carried out? How can they make something right now where they don't have to wait? And then how can they begin imagining like a future temporality, but the future that they imagine may not be the future that their future relatives want. And that's sort of like the tension there. So we can talk about that, kind of that tension, and how to work through that, or, that's the provocation. What's the epistemology of your community to enact that at a local scale? And you can think through like at a very like large scale, systems, institutions. But I think for my own community, they're weary of that. They're really weary of that. And I'll give one last example. One example of that is that Winnipeg in Manitoba, Canada, was named the most racist city in Canada. They have some of the highest missing and murdered Indigenous women rates. And there have been like a lot of folks getting disappeared or murdered through like ground transportation kind of networks. And so the community could have like put together a claim and showed up at a public hearing and said, we want safer transportation. But what they did is they organized their own community-driven transportation network to do that sort of caretaking within the community. And some might call it mutual aid. And I've heard some people kind of argue that, oh, you can get tired of doing mutual aid. I would push back and say, we're already doing it. We've been doing it. I call it community caretaking. And I guess, how does your community do its own community caretaking? Or how would you in your community conceive of doing community caretaking if you didn't rely on the nation state and you relied on your own worldviews? So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I mean, that was very eloquent, and I think you've touched on quite a number of the things that I know that Sherman and Dean Lazan earlier on when we were discussing democratizing futures, for instance, and we've got some time now for each of the panelists to take a slice, I guess, out of the very broad suite of ideas you offered us, Laura. And I'd like to start with Lisanne simply because, you know, I think what we're talking about, where Laura ended, talking about the role of, you know, a state or at that scale of, you know, of a country, thinking about democratizing futures and bringing in the indigenous voice, Lisanne. I think if you've no doubt would have had ideas sparking while Laura was talking. I'm just welcome you to say something. I'm going to keep an eye on the time so that I can make sure that everybody gets a chance to say something. So don't think I'm rude if I say, 1 more minute, please. And we'll do it that way. And of course, Laura, you can jump in and actually converse with the panelists, please, Laura.
Yeah,
okay, so
thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Marcus. That was very inspiring, Laura. And it really inspired me also to think about new ways and interact with our Arnstein. It's yeah, classic, right? Classic representation. It's really about opening an open space for everyone, wherein they can articulate their interests and rights. And we're just so lucky actually here in the Philippines that while we have around that is composed of 14 to 17 million in the indigenous peoples, protecting the rights, protecting the rights, culture, and of course their participation in governance. But you know, the colonization part here in the Philippines took around 300 years or more than that, and we have what we call the conflict between indigenous and exogenous frameworks, and having that. It's really to change the mindset of the people to really stay away from the so-called colonial mentality, because this one is influenced, of course, by media, the way of life that we have right now, and advertising is very influential, and that really we find it difficult to really change the mindset. But we at the Philippine Futures Thinking Society, we find it a purpose to revisit our culture, our environment, and somehow decolonize or indigenize our frameworks when we talk about policies, when we talk about governance, and when we talk about features. And in decolonization, we encounter constraints. And one, of course, is the system, leadership, and of course, mindset of the people. But we are not well, you know, to break that energy. We want to break that energy by introducing Hiraya Foresight. And that Hiraya Foresight is really about going back to the indigenous way of thinking. It's hard, but we can start by really communicating with our stakeholders, by communicating with our IPs or the indigenous peoples, and give them more space now in governance and in policy making. So so with that in mind, when I was young, I also recalled the process of the influence that we gained from our colonizers in city planning. No, in city planning, we still adhere, but I see now some improvements. We still adhere to the so-called grid or square dimension, wherein you have the church there, you have the plaza, you have the government office there, and when you hears the bell ringing, then it's time to go to church, it's time to go to town hall meetings, and so on and so forth. So we still have communities that are like that, but I think the modern urban planning here now is really different. It's really about incorporating environment, 70% greens and 30% structures, no? In some cases. So nice, our own culture, our own environment, our own space. And another story that I can share is our engagement with one of the indigenous groups in Mindanao, wherein still they have the rituals. So we experience the rituals, we experience the way they solve the problems, and in our research also, we cannot interfere the way they solve their problems. So we cannot say that a civil code or the criminal code will be applied to the indigenous people. No, still in the Philippines, they have their own way on how to resolve these issues. But really, I'm inspired with your presentation that in really engaging them and in further democratizing futures thinking in the Philippines through Hiraya Foresight, we can open more space for them. And it's not just a linear way of engaging them. Yeah, I think that's it, Marcus. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lisanne. That's great.
I just want to say something really quick about what you said, Lisanne, and it was about the bell ringing. Like, how can that, you can kind of conceive of that as kin space time too. Like, what does that invoke for people across time and into the future? And like, it's a different kind of knowledge, right? That's what I was talking about on like the embodied knowledge. Like, it's heard knowledge, but like, what would a soundscape look like of these sites with the bell ringing, and like the stories of the people that like the bell ringing means something very specific to them? And like, is that something that you want to intervene on, or that's something they want to see continue? But like, yeah, that kind of like makes me think too, like maybe for everybody here, like, what are these sort of like colonial soundscapes and what are the indigenous soundscapes? But yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
It's a beautiful idea. So thank you. Pratiksha, I'm queuing people individually beforehand so that they know that they're coming. So Pratiksha, could you please give us your thoughts on the presentation?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'll start off first by saying that I'm more of a reflective thinker. So my initial thoughts are just maybe creating lines with other things that I'm thinking, where not as much fully formed, more just my own, like my instinctive responses. When you're talking about stars, I just maybe 2-3 different thoughts. I've been reading a series of papers by a gentleman called Dan Hill. He leads innovation work with Vinnova, which is the Swedish government's innovation team. But anyways, one of his blog posts was, it's titled Between the Roofs and the Stars. And he talks about examples from different authors who are writing about these concepts in a way to sort of make sense of what was happening in the pandemic. And what really had resonated for me and I'd highlighted, which is really apt for this conversation, was there's an author he quoted called Rebecca Solnit, and she writes about when certain disasters hit in northeastern parts of the US at varying different decades, these big northeastern blackouts that happened, and there was a loss of electric power that meant that the light pollution that used to blot out the night sky vanished. And in these disaster-struck cities, people suddenly found themselves under the canopy of stars. that were still visible in small and remote places. And in essence, what he was making, and she was making an analogy to, was that when a certain kind of power fails in disaster, in its place appears a reversion to improvised, collaborative, cooperative, and local society. And what he adds to that and says is the corollary of one kind of system failure is that a new or perhaps old social order is revealed. The stars have been there all along. And so I think that really resonated to me because, you know, when we tend to forget something exists sometimes until something fails, and we're reminded actually that the most instinctive, the most like taken for granted fabric is actually there all along. It's just sort of been, you know, maybe blotted out with all the pollution. And the other thought that really, I've jotted down the 3-4 thoughts that really struck with me, and you know, something that I've been thinking a lot about is, especially in light of what's happening around the world right now, this notion of what you said, what does building relationality in your community look like? And you use the example of bead making. And I guess for me, some of the things I've been thinking about is, you know, for me, bead making perhaps, and maybe Laura, you can correct me if I'm wrong, seems like it's an intergenerational practice. And I've been thinking a lot about in our communities, what do we do now that actually is truly intergenerational beyond that of maybe interacting with your own grandparents? And really, how as communities, in light of what's been happening, how do we actually talk about other groups with whom we don't share familiar ties? And what does that look like with communities maybe that we don't even have much in common with? And how much as a society really there's a need to talk about them? By the mere fact that we're connected as human beings, not even just by other sort of quantifiers or, you know, tags. And the last thought I wanted to share that really has sort of struck with me is that around when you talked about the smell in the pawn shop, and for you, smell is more than memory. It was invoking that time, space, and kinship of your, you know, time with your uncles and your dads fixing cars. I think another sense that I think a lot about is sound. And a few years ago, when I think of my grandfather who passed away actually a decade ago today, I think about his voice. And a few years ago, what I bought was a hand recorder, and I went around my house with my mom, and I just recorded her voice, and I recorded my grandmother's voice. I recorded my mom laughing, because it's not a morbid thing. Maybe it sounds morbid, but at some point, my family won't be there. And so, sorry. It's, I think sound is so interesting to me, because when I hear my voice of my grandmother or my mom, and they live in different countries than I do, I think of them in a very multidimensional manner. And so how, when we isolate specific senses, do we actually create truly multidimensional experiences in our own minds? And so I think when you were talking about smell, doing that for you, I thought about how sound does that for me, and how a few years ago I started to collect sounds that really evoke something much, much visceral in me, when the collective senses come and maybe pollute, you know, I don't feel it to that extent. So anyways, those were just some thoughts that really struck for me and when you were speaking. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Pratisha.
Yeah,
thank you.
that's
Very,
great
very
that you're building a future archive for your family. You know, I think that that's really powerful what you're talking about, and I think that that's an aspect of it too. Is that you in doing that, like you are I mean, to me, that sounds like futurity, because you're creating what you need right now, but then you're also creating an archive of that knowledge for like your future relatives. I think it's great, and thank you for sharing that powerful story. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Let's turn to Mexico, where Mauricio is, and he's already had the good fortune of chatting with Laura the other day with me. So you've probably also had thoughts from them, Mauricio. I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Hi, everyone. And just listening to Pratisha and thinking about our previous conversation with Laura and reading her book, I think this reminds me something that I was very recently discussing with a colleague futurist. And we were talking about the importance of family as the first contact we should have with futures and with futures thinking. And I think that's something that we don't discuss a lot in our profession. and in our discipline. But family is very important. It is like our first contact with the past, with the present, and the future, which leads me to this wonderful futurity concept that Laura has created, and I think it's just wonderful to think that in the same we have everything in the same time, past, present, and the future, and just taking something from her book, like thinking in the past, like unactivated possibilities of our ancestors, taking them, and then living out the future we wish for in a contemporary moment, referring to the present. And I think this is beautiful, because I think that in Foresight we do this a lot. I mean, this is what we do. We think about the future because actually we want to change the present. And this is exactly what I understand by Laura's text in this part. Like, this is exactly living out the future we wish for in a contemporary moment right now. It's like not accepting a not yet for an answer, as she has said before. And then the creation of the conditions for our relatives in a future temporality. And also, I think I have discussed this sometimes with colleagues. We have to be good ancestors, and we forget about that very often. Like, it is amazing to see how this book from Laura, coming from the Muskogee wisdom, is very similar to some other texts and some other thinking in indigenous groups. For instance, in my country, in Mexico, we have almost 70 indigenous groups here. And when I read this at first, I realized that there are a lot of similarities with what our indigenous groups have written for a long time, for centuries. And then I realized that we are always wondering about the future and thinking about the best futures. And maybe we have to go back and go to the past and realize that maybe the best foresight are our indigenous groups, for instance, in our countries, because they knew the importance of community. They knew the importance of thinking about past, present, and future in the same thing, as one united space. And they have known that for a long time. And coming from a country like Mexico, I would like to say that mostly we are now like mestizo in general, but more than between 7 and 10 million people are indigenous, and they define themselves as indigenous. And that's more like many countries in the world. So we have to discuss this in countries like mine, because we are very often looking at examples of what future we want outside our country. And we are looking at some development models in the outside. And I think we should realize that maybe the answers are also inside our countries. And we have to discuss that, and we have to realize that maybe the answers we are looking for are in here. And I don't think we are doing that. In general, sometimes I consider we have a crisis of identity. We are mestizo, but we are also indigenous. And in the end, that's very confusing for a lot of people regarding the future. We are very proud of our past. We are very proud of our culture, and we are very proud of our history. But we are very confused about our future. I don't think we have discussed what kind of future we want. And I would take these elements from Laura's book, for instance, as something very, very important as a departing point to think about the best options for our future. And that's what I would like to say today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Laura? And Eva, I'm going to ask you next.
Yeah, I was just thinking on that too, that it's down here. Just the thing about like indigenous knowledge, especially in Latin America and actually in arid climates, when I think about the Southwest, is that like folks are grappling with like climate change and that sort of thing, especially around like droughts. And you have folks like Zuni, Hopi, various Pueblo groups that they already were handling that, right? And it still goes back to like indigenous knowledge being very locally based and very much maybe centered around like that kind of collectiveness and collective caretaking. And I would urge folks to look at the United Nations Rights on Indigenous Peoples, UN DRIP, and just read like some of those articles. I think it says a lot. It talks about a lot of different dimensions about indigenous knowledge and ways of being in the world. But yeah, like around architecture, that's what we found in doing different studio classes in Latin America, is around architecture and some of these, what folks value in their local environment and how to create community around traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge and that sort of thing. But I'll tell you, Mauricio, I was really perplexed too around like the mestizo identity and like indigenous identity when doing work in Latin America and being like, you look indigenous, I don't understand, what? Like in terms of like some of the values that like sort of got talked about. But thank you, Mauricio.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's very, very interesting. And of course, this identity issue is key. Where do we place ourselves in both past, present, and future? So I'm going to hand it over to Eva now to see what you've been thinking. You said you've been taking notes, Eva. So we're interested to hear what you've got to share with us.
I was not taking full notes so that I would give you like a full presentation, but there's sometimes some words that resonate with me. And I think to share with colleagues that are on the call, some of you have been familiar with indigenous futurity, some have heard about decolonial futures, or some are just curious about what's going on in the room and getting to hear people you may not have heard from before. I think something that resonated last with me was this idea that futures got a lot to do with the way we learn and how we've been taught to learn. And I think for many of the futurists on the call, some of the things that we usually, or taught at least, is this idea that we need to start where people are at. So that's a futures process, no matter where it's supposed to lead us to, in terms of objectives, in terms of methodologies to be applied. What matters is that obviously people in the room understand that they first need to put on the table the futures that they know first before we think about future that they might not know about. And I'll first start with examples that are actually not in the indigenous context for you to also see what appeals to me in that type of work. So for example, we're organizing a lab for a bank, and it's actually was one of the largest banking association in Europe. And it was interesting to see how they understood the process that we're going through. So this idea of developing a capability in order to understand how to use the future and why it would be pertinent to actually render that work a little bit more conscious. And their first request, or the last request as part of the process, was actually for us to work on anything, anticipation for the future, anticipation for emergence, as long as we did not question growth. And well, of course, I see some of you smiling to that request, but there's this idea that, you know, futures work that we conduct, there are fears that are associated with those. And I could see the same type of amount of fears in the way when I run labs in different places on the continent, and this idea of developing Black futures and African futures, we get to see that we are convinced of what the answer is supposed to be. And as we reach out to actually implement the futures process, our first idea is that we know where we want to go. It's just we're using that tool because then it's supposed to help us and save us from ourselves. And this idea that we're using futures as a way to never change is part of the colonial project that has been ongoing for already several centuries. In fact, if we think about the colonial project in itself, it's very much of a future project and or a project for the future. And the way indigenous communities, and here we have a definition that is, of course, larger led by First Peoples in the Americas, but also thinking about here African futures, there are ways of knowing that actually have been diminished, or ways of knowing that actually have been considered to be not relevant. And in the way we reach out, whenever we're actually thinking about development or freedom, and all of those terms that are already heavily loaded, there is an approach that I always noticed amongst participants, which is to tell us what we would like for the world to look like this and for the world to look like that, without questioning the sources of our imagination, without questioning basically our perspective of where we're coming from. And this idea of rendering us conscious of how colonized we have been, I think is, first of all, one of the advantage of futures processes. But then the second one is also the liberation of other ways of knowing. And so I was really glad to get to know and learn from Laura on the way it's considered to be deeply rooted in ways that have been approaching futures within her own community. And I would say that what's also interesting is acknowledging the points of connections and the changes that are encountered. So when we're talking about indigenous futures, we are aware of the fact that we've been colonized. And so some of the ideas, some of the ways of learning, some of the ways of being, and some of the ways of doing have been affected by a series of events that we were not masters of. But now, once we've acknowledged that, taking that into consideration and thinking about how we can make it closer to where we're coming from, I think is really key. And so I end just on the last example, which was the last lab that I run in Togo on the future of value. And the whole point was that we're trying to get rid of our colonial currency, which is the CFA franc. That is basically the currency for 14 countries in Francophone Africa. And why is it a colonial currency? Well, first, it's part of the title. Basically, CFA used to mean Colonie Française d'Afrique, which means French colonies of Africa. Well, now it means Francophone communities of Africa, but we do know where it's coming from. It's pegged to the euro, and our stock exchange rates were actually located directly in the Bank of France, up to 50%. So it's not difficult to see to what extent it would be a colonial currency. But the issue that we have is that as people are saying, well, we'd like to get rid of that currency, we're not given the opportunity to just talk about a larger conversation that is not only about the monetary instrument, it's not only about the currency, it's actually about what type of development we want to have. It's about, and by development, we don't mean what part of international organizations or governments outside have meant about development. We want to know what it means to imagine a future that would be meaningful to us, using our own terms, using our own words, and to actually redefine part of the conversation. And the problem that we had is that first they wanted to do something on the future of the currency or the future of the CFA franc, and to move them towards actually embracing the future of value was already a first step to actually reframe the conversations. And I think in that sense, it gives us a series of pointers. We have a role as futurists to actually kind of get to hear what is said and what is unsaid in the room, but also to support some of the imaginaries that maybe sometimes are shy because we don't believe that it's a good answer, and actually to try to give it a shot. That would be the first comment. And the second one is also for us not to act as the contributors of the oppression that sometimes futurists can actually put onto people. And this idea that sometimes, if we're thinking about the future of currency, yes, there's automatically processes that we have in mind. We're going to actually think about having a central bank. We're going to think about a state, because a currency is actually the tool that is used by a state. We're going to think about community building, but from an institutional perspective and not from a community-based perspective. And so all of those elements are actually key indicators that we can hear. Not necessarily because we'll be able to tell people this is where you should go, and then that's the answer for the next century or even 7th generation if we're using the Iroquois constitutions approach. But actually as a way to invite for more imaginaries in the room, for people to have a safe space for those meaningful conversations to be had.
Thank you very much, Laura.
Yeah, thank you, Eva. I think what really stood out was the idea of what you said, the shy imaginaries in the room. How do you kind of like get them to come forward with what they're talking about? But yeah, that's really great, the work that you're talking about of kind of intervening at such a large scale. And I guess, yeah, it's like, I have so many questions, like how do you raise consciousness to a point that people are ready to do that kind of work? Because I know like in my own community, it's kind of like people are in this daily grind of just like securing shelter, securing food, and that kind of work. And it's like the idea of even like the time or even the care to kind of like think through some of these larger systemic issues, which are really important. But like, yeah, how do you kind of raise that consciousness with folks at a local scale, Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. That question about the quiet voice is actually very important, and it links up, I think, with one of the key things that struck me in Laura's book, as well as what you just presented, was what did you call it? Ethnographic refusal. But to me, refusal is part of an active futures, and I think I'm going to not go on to that myself because I want to invite. Who was it? Mod of Heart. That's right. I texted you or messaged you and you said you would go next. So I'm going to back out and let Mod of Heart go.
Okay, thank you, Marcus, and thank you very much, Laura, for the presentation and the ideas. Actually, I'm from a part of the world where indigenous communities and is not something we are familiar with. But of course, as much of the rest of the world, we are familiar with colonies and decolonization and the dealing with the aftermath after the colony left, and and that's how we can relate to your speech. I want to highlight two points here. The first one is the perception of time, that I think this is very important. And as someone working in the future studies domain, this is very important to how people perceiving time, the importance of the understanding and designing the futuring or future thinking activities around the local communities and the context where you are operating on. And to use the values and the narrative and world views of that local communities, whether it's like indigenous communities or other communities. I can give one example from my context where I come from, a Muslim Arab background communities. The tradition here, when we speak about how we perceive time, is that time is the domain where you act, where you operate. So the tradition urges you to take action, to be responsible about your actions, and to transfer that responsibility into action. So, and I can also relate to what you mentioned about the spheres or the spaces where you operate. And here, our tradition here is that you are first of all responsible about yourself, and then you can extend this responsibility to your family, community, and at large for the whole world. And most important thing is the responsibility that you take for future generations. So, and here I can relate to your your idea or line of thought about, linking with ancestors and we ourselves being the ancestors of the coming generations. So I think this is very important. And when I did the Where I Am From poem, I saw that thinking materialized in a poem, which is like great, where I'm from, and all these stories, or like the exact naming of our ancestors and how we feel about that. And here maybe we can also speak about how we feel is also important, because I think this, when it comes over time, and you're building the indigenous or the local knowledge, it goes with this line of thought where building this knowledge through trial and error, and of course it's like distinguishes one community from another. So the drawings, the symbols that you showed, maybe I can relate to that in my community, but maybe in another form. Right. So I think, again, this is important to think about, localization of knowledge and the localization of the tools, the narratives, and the world views, and how we use that in the futuring and thinking about the future. One last thing I want to finish with is about, how we can transfer this line of thought, how we can transfer this thinking to our children and grandchildren, that we can use the history, our roots, our stories from our ancestors to build this kind of of knowledge and narrative and all the views that will empower our future generation to have a greater sense of agency about the future, and to translate that into action, again, to the basic idea I started with, which is the present is the domain where you act to shape the future. And without taking that level of agency and having that mindset that you can change and you can shape your future, you cannot really take the action and take that sense of responsibilities. Thanks again, and briefly, this is like my intake, but I have a lot of ideas and the questions maybe later on for Laura. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Modafar.
Thank you, Modafar. Yeah, I appreciate your kind of feedback on that poetry exercise, and I'm really happy to hear you say something about the idea of felt knowledge, and that when you were carrying out that poem, the kind of feelings that it surfaced in. I know that Marcus kind of said a little bit too. I think he said it made his heart sore writing it. And like, what does that kind of mean for our places that we're kind of like trying to create and think on? The other thing that you kind of mentioned was about like, how do you kind of transfer that line of thought and of like localization of knowledge and worldviews and thinking about the future? And I'm just wondering, like, how again does that go back to what are the things that community likes to come around together? Like I said, beating, and actually when I was in New Mexico, like there's like a whole kind of lowrider car culture. That's something that people like to come around, maybe like community block parties or dancing, but it's kind of like, what is the local thing in your community that people come together on? And I really like that idea too, about like the intergenerational dimension. Like what are kind of the intergenerational aspects? And just kind of like to offer it up to everybody, like what are kind of the art-based practices too that people can come around together on? So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you. Yeah, we are about to go over time, but we're having a fantastic conversation. So I'm giving myself permission to go over time. And I'm turning now to Sophia to get a take from you, please, Sophia.
Hi, everyone. Yes, so many amazing thoughts. I think, like Pratisha, I'm pretty reflective about this and lots of thoughts swirling around. So I'll just share a couple of things, some points that came up for me. For one, I come to you as a first generation Haitian American who's living in Bali, Indonesia, has lived on several different continents, and is from Nyack, New York, which is Munsee tribe language for fishing place. So whenever we have these conversations about indigeneity, there's a lot of emotions that are stirred and that come up. There's a lot of identities that are in contradiction or in conflict, and it's been quite a journey. And it continues. It's a continuous journey to develop an understanding and a relationship with this work and my role in it. Particularly now, one of the things that's really weighing on me is the situation in Haiti. I would like to focus there because, one, it's in the news again, and I feel like I keep coming back to this parallel between indigeneity in North America and other places, and you mentioned movement, which is so important to self-determination, the ability to be able to move, but you were forcefully moved. In Haiti, there was no dispossession from the land. We were allowed to keep our land, but so thoroughly dispossessed of our identities and our rights to self-determination. It was a systematic destruction of a people through economic sanctions. I mean, Haiti was forced to pay 35 billion to France in 1825 to maintain their freedom. How can a people ever establish any kind of agency if from the gate, yes, they were able to establish the first, overthrow slavery and establish the first democracy, but that's never been acknowledged because it was too much of a threat to the powers that be. This revolution took place at the same time as the French Revolution and as just after the American Revolution as well, but it's never talked about in the same context. But in Haiti, the Society of Equals is established. And I find myself continuously going back to what lessons might have been learned there. But are they there anymore? The situation there is just, I don't have any answers right now. But what I do see is with the most recent earthquake and now hurricane that followed directly after they were robbed by the Red Cross and the Clinton Foundation and never given any money out of the billions that were raised, grassroots organizations are the ones who are taking care of the people and who are making sure that their needs are met. So not yet, but when and how and what are we owed? I do believe in reparations, and I do believe that there is money that needs to be, like, there are costs to actually enabling a people to finally gain some stability. I don't know how that would happen. It's too much corruption, complications. So that's my thoughts on Haiti. Now, some other thoughts were that it's funny that I've lived in these places and I tend to draw towards island places. So I've lived in Thailand and I've lived in Bali now. And it's, yes, restitution and reconciliation, indeed. And I've lived in these places. And at first, when I got here, the smell of burning trash used to bother me so much. Oh my God, that's so terrible for the environment. And then I realized it reminded me of being in Haiti. Like in island countries, there's the smell of cooking food on the streets, and then you see tin roofs. And for some people, it might look like poverty. But those things, while my family is all the way across the world, I feel a connection to these people who have the same type of ways of living and knowing with the land. For example, slashing and burning is now, oh, maybe that's not the worst thing. So there are these traditions that have remained. And another thing that made me think about, was yes, living here and living in all these other places, and the connection with the unactivated possibilities of our ancestors, or being our ancestors' wildest dreams. And I do feel like, although my ancestors were trapped on the island of Haiti and my family is there, I am out here in the world, and I think that is who I was meant to be. I find connection in watching Balinese women spend 4 days prepare for a ceremony with palm leaves and weaving things. And I find watching families stick together here very beautiful. The idea of having to get out of your house when you're 18 years old and suddenly be on your own, I'm unlearning that myself because that's a very Western thing. Like lots of families stay intergenerational and you don't get kicked out of your parents' house and have to get a job and be independent and be on your own. So I'm unlearning a lot of things and it's highly confronting at times, but it's been a really beautiful and humbling journey. And it continues to evolve. And I just find myself thinking about, ontological expansiveness or expansionism. What's there to observe and admire and connect with from a distance? And what do you leave for people? For example, voodoo. I'm actually really glad it's been demonized in culture because that was ours and it remains ours and it will forever be ours. There are things that I do believe if you don't have a particular connection to the place and to the blood and to everything that comes with being of those people, that those are not necessarily meant for you. So when we're talking about indigenous futurity, something I want to see in futures is firstly more indigenous folks speaking for themselves and given positions in universities and in the hallowed halls of academia to do things that people are citing in their research. Because if we're culling inspiration, why can't we just get it direct from the source rather than borrowing? And also in Bali and many other places, ideas around spirituality are, they're applied with a very, at times, neoliberal and capitalistic and commodified way. And I think we really need to be critical about ways we engage with this. We're not going to get it right all the time. I love that we have 100 and some odd people in this room who are curious. We're going to make mistakes, but being open to other ways of knowing and hearing it from people who are actually of these people, I think is the first step, and listening, right? Listening and allowing people to speak for themselves. So those are some of my thoughts. There's notes that are not very organized, and I'm sure this will be an ongoing conversation, but thank you so much. Laura, it's a pleasure, and everybody who went before me. I mean, you guys are brilliant, brilliant people. I love futures, yay.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you very much. Yeah, and this question of pain and rage at injustice, I think, is part of futurity too. I don't think we need to sanitize the way we respond as emotional and embodied beings. But I'm going to hand it over to Laura to take it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, Marcus. Like, you guys got this morning or afternoon, whatever, you guys got the piece of it that, okay, here's a scholarship. But like, I'm like, Sophie, I'm like, okay, like we have all this crap going on. We have like the governor of the state of Oklahoma not wanting to honor tribal sovereignty and setting up, it was a community impact meeting of how a major Supreme Court ruling that recognizes the Mvskoke Creek Reservation, a community impact meeting to basically complain about the way that Native folks are handling this new ruling. So there's so much messed up stuff going on, but I really appreciate, Sophia, you really like stating your responsibility, your accountability. Like I appreciate folks that like state their location from which they're coming. And I remember when I was in graduate school and I was kind of like in critical ethnic studies, and I remember somebody stating that like we state our positionality and from where we're coming before we begin our talk. And then I was like, why do we have to state it when like the West or kind of like the colonizer doesn't have to state their positionality and their intent? So like, I really appreciate you like stating your positionality, right? You know, the other thing too that really resonated big time with what you were saying, I mean, a lot of it, like the biggest thing of like how these structures really impose on communities and like these bubbles of freedom that the grassroots organizations are creating within these really like crisis moments and caring for the people, where the nation state is maybe failing, or these huge organizations like Red Cross is failing. But the idea of, you said voodoo being demonized, and so like you don't have people that are wanting to come and appropriate it, right? And then on the flip side of that, like indigenous ways of knowing, that is something that people maybe are trying to appropriate. And there's kind of like in indigenous research methods, there's like a lot of writing about that, like nothing about indigenous people without indigenous people. So like the idea of like in futures work kind of being, it's a really fine line of like, if you're going to invoke some of these frameworks, like being in conversation with the folks, with the indigenous folks from or peoples from which the ideas and concepts come from, being in relationship. How can you be in relationship? How can you reciprocate, right? So like if you're asking a community to do something or an indigenous person to do something, how are you reciprocating them for their time? How are you compensating them for their time? Like in my community, if we ask somebody to do something, we give them like a gift, or we compensate them for their time. And that's sort of like the whole thing across Indian country. If I ask maybe somebody to come and talk to my class, if they're like a grad student, maybe I'll give them some money. If there's somebody that money doesn't really mean anything, I'll bead something, because beadwork takes like days to finish. And that's like a different kind of like showing of anogechka, of love and appreciation. Like I made this for you and it took me like 2 to 3 days to make this. That's like something different. So I think that that's part of building relationships too. So like I would definitely say like in futures work to really work on building relations. And I know that some indigenous groups, they don't want their ideas plugged in and moved forward by other communities. And exactly. I think that's been one of the biggest things whenever I do a talk, is that afterwards people come up and they say, how can I take what you're talking about and plug it in with what I'm doing here? And then it's like, well, maybe it's not really meant to plug in where you're at or for your context, but it's always sort of like, people are like, well, what does this mean for me? Well, I mean, I don't know. You have to figure that out yourself. I mean, it took me like an entire lifetime to figure out like this book. So it's kind of like, you're going to have to figure that out yourself and do the work, because I had to put in the work for this. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Sophia.
It's a great point, Laura. Yeah, very true. So Noel is our last person. We began in the Philippines with Lizanne, and we will end with Noel making some points from the Philippines as well. So over to you, Noel.
Yes, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone. For context, the Philippines has been colonized for almost 500 years. Imagine, 350 years under the Spaniards, 50 years under the Americans, and 5 years under the Japanese. So as we say in the Philippines, we were inside the convent for 350 years, in Hollywood for 50 years, and under the samurais for 5 years. So imagine the colonization, the image of colonization that the Philippines was, and even now. So along the way, we lost a lot of things. The intangibles, examples, languages. We lost around 200, 300 languages in the course of the colonization. And not only that, we lost a whole cohort of gods, deities. Gods and deities were erased from our memories. Just imagine that how impactful that was among our people, losing your gods, your deities, because an imposing religion took over and imposed their belief upon us. And not only that, we also lost tangibles or the movables of our cultures. They were exported and auctioned in Europe and the Americas. So we were bereft with anything. We lost our identity, we lost our gods, we lost our tongues, we lost our language. So that's too much to take, right? And during those times, we were saying that the Philippines was under the dark ages. We were eclipsed. It was a solar eclipse of the Philippines. It was all dark because imagine, you lost your faith, you lost your belief your way of thinking, your way of life. So those were the dark days for the Philippines. But right now, after almost 500 years, actually this year, 2021, we're celebrating the 500 years of our founding, so-called founding by Magellan. And also a victory for us because Magellan was killed here in the Philippines. So yay. So how about that? So right now, our country is is doing a massive restoration of our culture. We're trying to save everything that we can for the future generations. Right now, we're documenting, recording rituals, rites, sounds, languages, even seascapes, waterscapes. We're trying to digitize everything to record and archive and also map. We map everything, our tangibles, intangibles. Then we mine. We're trying to mine how might we use this for our future generations, for our generation right now. From mapping to mining, and now we're also minding the treasures. Minding meaning how to make sense of what our ancestors would like us to be. How might our ancestors think about the future, our present right now? Because we were their future. We were their dreams before. We were just their imaginations before. We were their hiraya. So we always say here in the Philippines, just recently when we lost the language, because there was this powerful greeting in the Philippines that was lost when the Spaniards came in. We call it Hiraya Manawari. Hiraya Manawari means, by the power of my will and with the purest of my hope, my heart and intentions, may all your dreams come true. Right? How powerful is that? I mean, a culture, a people, a nation, all rooting for you to succeed, all rooting for your happiness. It's just like Yoda telling Luke Skywalker to, may the force be with you, right? Imagine that, how powerful that is, how powerful that message of Hiraya Manawari, of rooting for everybody, of wanting everyone to succeed, of wanting everyone to be happy in their lives and in their futures. So with that, I wish you all Hiraya Manawari from the Philippines. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Laura.
Yeah, thank you for that. It actually really kind of harkens Joy Harjo's poem, which it's called Map to the Next World, which really was a call to action for me in my scholarship. And it's basically, you know, like our intangible and tangible aspects of who we are have been ravaged. We've been dispossessed of that. Maybe we don't know our entire songs. We don't know every deity anymore. But how do we make a map to the next world? And so, like, if you guys get a chance, check out her poem and how she kind of talks about a map to the next world, but basically that it's embodied, like, well, it's kind of like we'll figure it out together. So I really like, you know, what you were talking about in terms of how you ended it. And Leanne Simpson, she's an indigenous feminist scholar, and she talks about decolonial love and that it's living a life that is full. So how do we live a life that is full? How do we not put a ceiling on kind of the spatial imaginary that we wish for, even while we are hindered by structural influences? Like, I think of what Sophia said about Haiti, or maybe like even the conditions here in the US and North America and Latin America around what the nation, like the crushing kind of things that the nation state's doing. How do you continue to create like these bubbles of freedoms? Because in part, that's part of a map to the next world as well. So I will leave it at that.
That's a fantastic way to end it, actually, Laura, that map to the next world. Because the map to the next world is, in my experience, at least both an inner map and inner journey, as well as a collective journey. It's also a journey beyond species identity and beyond the sort of anthropocentric limits that we place upon ourselves. There's been a lot of beautiful questioning and sort of a subtext going on in the chat there, Laura. You've probably not been following it, but been some very, very rich material there. But I'm very much aware that we're now well over time. And I just want to thank you all. For me, the anticipatory is what we are involved with. We anticipate, and to me, futurity as a verb, as a process, as something with no beginning and no end, we are dipping into, as though we're dipping into a stream with a bucket and drawing out that which can sustain us as we struggle to be freer, a little freer every day, freer from the oppressions that we carry within us wherever we sit. The colonizers are colonized. We must. That doesn't mean we need to forgive them or forgive us, our cultures for what they're doing, but we need to understand that the colonizers are colonized and they are victims of their own success, in a sense, and that's what we're experiencing globally. So anyway, I'm going to stop because I can feel a rant coming on, and I'm going to not rant. I want to hand it back to Sherman, but just before I do, Laura has mentioned a couple of times Joy Harjo, and I can recommend her. She's a great singer as well. She writes fantastic music. She's a musician, a poet. She was at some stage, or maybe she still is she was a poet laureate for, I think, the US or something like that. Am I right, Laura? Yeah.
I think she still is. I think she might be in her third term now, which is kind of unprecedented.
Okay, so a very significant visionary artist drawing on, I think, a fascinating fusion of cultures to make, very powerful statements. That's all from me. Thank you so much, and I'm going to hand back to Sherman to do what Sherman does best, which is say hi and then bye.
Yeah, and before that, actually, we'll be releasing a visual report for the conversation that we have. Chloe is working on that. We will be sharing them in our social media, the Association of Professional Futurists. But it was really a good conversation, lots of pendulum swing, from systemic to the personal to the professional, keywords that, came out. And then perhaps some provocation is a conversation about intimacy, empathy, ethics, and conscience, and choice, and cosmos, and language, food, and dances, and memories, stories, meanings, experiences, and data as well. In fact, with all of these ideas and conversation and meanings that emerge from this conversation, perhaps it's now a time for us to just ask the question, how might we be able to reconceptualize foresight and its impacts? So I would end with that. And again, thank you very much for joining us. And we have shared this on YouTube and on our social media. It has been shared live. And again, thank you very much. On behalf of the Association of Professional Futurists, have a wonderful morning, afternoon, and evening. Hiraya Manawari.